Welcome to Borrowed Pain, stories that shrink your problems and expand your peace. Today we're traveling to 1902 to a city of 30,000 souls who had just 3 minutes when their mountain finally woke up. So get comfortable and let's begin. Part 1. The Paris of the Caribbean. In the spring of 1902, as the 20th century was still finding its feet, there existed a city that should have lived forever. Saint-Pierre, they called it. St. Peter, named for the apostle who held the keys to heaven. Perhaps there was an irony in that name that no one could have imagined. This was a city that held its own keys to commerce, to culture, to the very heart of the Caribbean's French Empire. 30,000 souls called it home, though that number would swell during the day as workers streamed in from the countryside, drawn by the promise of wages in the bustling warehouses, shops, and distilleries that lined its cobblestone streets. Picture, if you will, a morning in late April. The sun rises over the Caribbean Sea, painting the water in shades of turquoise and gold. The light creeps up the beaches of black volcanic sand that tells a story of ancient eruptions, though no one pays it much mind anymore. The morning light touches the red-tiled roofs of the city, climbing up the hillside where Saint-Pierre spreads itself like an amphitheater facing the sea. Above it all, Mount Pelée stands sentinel, its slopes covered in the deep green of tropical forest, its peak often wrapped in a crown of clouds. The mountain hasn't shown anger in anyone's living memory. It's simply there, the way mountains are, permanent, unchanging, benign. In the streets below, the city is already stirring. The fish market near the waterfront comes alive before dawn, as the fishing boats return with their catch. The air fills with the cries of vendors, the slap of fish on wooden tables, the rapid-fire patois of haggling. Marie-Rose, who has sold fish at the same stall for 20 years, arranges her red snappers in neat rows, their scales catching the morning light like scattered coins. She knows every customer by name, knows whose husband is ill, whose daughter is getting married, whose son has found work at the Guérin sugar factory up the coast. By 7 o'clock, the streets fill with a river of humanity. Horse-drawn carriages clatter over cobblestones, carrying the wealthy merchants and their wives. The Prentice family, recently arrived from Massachusetts, maintains a villa on the hill. Thomas Prentice came to expand his import business, drawn by Saint-Pierre's reputation as the commercial hub of the French West Indies. His wife Clara still marvels at the strangeness of it all, the humid air that makes her northern clothes cling uncomfortably, the cascade of French and Creole voices in the streets, the way the tropical sun seems to press down with an almost physical weight. Their children, freed from the constraints of Boston society, run wild in the garden among the banana trees and bougainvillea. The city's architecture tells the story of its prosperity. Grand stone warehouses line the waterfront, their facades decorated with ironwork as intricate as lace. The Cathedral of Saint-Pierre rises above the rooftops, its spire reaching toward heaven, its bells marking the hours with bronze voices that echo off the mountain. The theater, rivals anything you might find in Paris itself. Just last week, a touring company performed Molière to a packed house, the tropical heat making fans flutter throughout the audience like a flock of nervous birds. This is why they call it the Paris of the Caribbean. Where else in these islands can you find such sophistication? The shops along Rue Victor Hugo display the latest fashions from France, though they arrive 3 months late and cost triple what they would in Marseille. The cafes serve proper coffee and croissants that almost taste like home to the French colonials, who gather there each morning to discuss politics and sugar prices. The clubs maintain their exclusivity, with the careful precision of social surgery, separating the white French colonials at the top, the mixed-race middle class below them, and ensuring the black population knows exactly where they stand in this carefully orchestrated hierarchy. Governor Louis Mouttet understands this hierarchy intimately. From his residence, he can look down upon the entire city, a view that reinforces his position at the apex of colonial power. He's been governor for only a few months, but already he knows that maintaining order is everything. The election scheduled for May 11th weighs on his mind. The Progressive Party candidate speaks of reform, of changing the old colonial ways. Dangerous talk, Mouttet thinks, especially with the black and mixed-race population beginning to assert their voting rights. No, the election must proceed smoothly, must reinforce the traditional order. Nothing must be allowed to disrupt it. In his study, Mouttet reviews the morning's correspondence. There's a note from the mayor about some minor earth tremors felt in the northern parishes. There's a complaint from a plantation owner about sulfur smells affecting his workers. Small matters, really. The governor sets these aside and focuses on what truly matters, ensuring his Conservative Party maintains control. His wife is coming from Fort-de-France next week to be with him for the election. Her presence will show confidence, stability, the unwavering nature of French colonial rule. Down in the commercial district, Andreas Hurar opens his shoemaker's shop as he has every morning for the past 15 years. The smell of leather and glue fills the small space. Hurar is a meticulous man who keeps a diary, recording not just his business transactions, but his observations of city life. Today he writes about the unusually warm weather, about the way the mountains seemed to shimmer yesterday afternoon, about his daughter's upcoming wedding planned for late May. He notes that orders are up, a good sign for the economy. Several wealthy families have commissioned new shoes for the election celebrations. The social season is in full swing. Despite the heat, or perhaps because of it, the city's elite throw themselves into a whirlwind of parties, dinners, and dances. At the Cercle de l'Hermine, the most exclusive club in the city, members sip rum punch and play cards while discussing the latest news from Paris. The Dreyfus affair still generates heated debate, though it happened an ocean away. Someone mentions the volcanic activity on the nearby island of Saint-Vincent. Their Mount Soufrière has been acting up for months now. "Thank God our Pelée is quiet," someone says, and everyone raises their glasses in agreement. The rhythm of daily life in Saint-Pierre has a particular quality, languid yet purposeful, tropical yet French. In the morning, before the heat becomes oppressive, the city bustles with activity. By noon, shutters close against the sun, and a drowsy quiet descends. The afternoon rain, when it comes, drums on the red tiles and floods the gutters, sending small rivers down the sloped streets toward the sea. Then, as evening approaches, the city comes alive again. The cafes fill, music spills from doorways, and the sound of laughter and conversation creates a symphony of human contentment. At the customs house, ships from around the world unload their cargo. Sugar and rum head out, the lifeblood of Martinique's economy. Manufactured goods come in, everything the island cannot produce for itself. Captain Marino Leboff of the Italian ship Orsolina watches the stevedores unload his cargo of marble and olive oil. He's made this run dozens of times, knows the rhythms of the port like his own heartbeat. Something feels different this time, though he cannot say what. Maybe it's the unusual number of centipedes he's seen on the dock, or the way the birds seem restless, wheeling in great flocks over the city. The children of Saint-Pierre grow up bilingual, switching between French and Creole as easily as breathing. They play in the narrow alleys between buildings, their games interrupted only by the passing of a horse cart or the call of their mothers for dinner. They know every hidden corner of the city, every garden wall that can be climbed, every shopkeeper who might spare a piece of candy for a sweet smile. They swim in the river Roxlane that runs through the city, though their parents warn them to stay away after heavy rains when the water runs fast and dangerous. In the evening, as the tropical darkness falls with its characteristic swiftness, the city lights begin to glow. Gas lamps line the main streets, casting pools of yellow light that moths dance around in dizzy spirals. From the harbor, Saint-Pierre looks like a constellation that has fallen to earth, its lights reflecting in the calm water of the bay. On the mountain above, there is only darkness, the deep, quiet darkness of the tropical forest, where fer-de-lance snakes hunt in the undergrowth, and the only sounds are the whisper of leaves and the occasional cry of a night bird. The newspaper, Les Colonies, publishes every morning except Sunday. Its editor, Marius Hurard, no relation to the shoemaker, prides himself on keeping the citizens informed about everything from shipping schedules to society gossip. The paper's offices occupy a building near the cathedral, and the sound of the printing press working through the night has become part of the city's nocturnal rhythm. Tomorrow's edition will mention the minor earth tremors, but buried on page 3, after the news about the upcoming election and the announcement of a new shipment of goods at Maison Clerche. As April draws to a close, Saint-Pierre exists in a state of perfect confidence. The city has survived hurricanes, earthquakes, and fires. It has grown from a small settlement to the jewel of the French Caribbean. The mountain that rises above it has been quiet for so long that its very name, Pelée, meaning bald or peeled, seems to speak only of its bare upper slopes, not of any danger. The few scientists who have studied it classify it as essentially extinct, or at most, dormant. The last significant eruption was in 1851, and that had been minor, more of a curiosity than a catastrophe. The city's prosperity seems unshakable. The rum distilleries work at full capacity, their sweet, heavy scent drifting over the northern quarters when the wind is right. The Bank of Martinique's vaults hold fortunes in gold francs. The warehouses bulge with sugar waiting for the next ships. The hospital, run by the Sisters of St. Paul, has just added a new wing. There's talk of installing electric streetlights next year, of building a new dock to accommodate larger steamships, of paving more streets to reduce the dust that plagues the dry season. This is Saint-Pierre in its final spring, confident, prosperous, alive with the business of living. A city where the future seems as certain as the sunrise, where plans are made months and years in advance, where the only question that matters is whether the Conservative Party will maintain its grip on power. The mountain watches over it all, silent and seemingly eternal, keeping its secrets for just a few more days. Part 2. The Mountain Wakes. February in Martinique carries its own particular sweetness. The crushing heat of summer hasn't yet arrived, the trade winds blow steady and cooling, and the sugar cane stands tall in the fields, ready for harvest. In 1902, February began like every February before it, with plantation workers moving through the cane fields in the pre-dawn darkness, their machetes catching the first light of day. It was these workers, the ones who knew the land most intimately, who noticed the first changes. Up on the upper slopes of Mount Pelée, near the plantation of Lance Belleville, a field hand named Baptiste mentioned to his overseer that the air smelled wrong. Not bad exactly, just wrong. Like matches, he said. Like someone had struck 1,000 matches and let them burn out. The overseer, a practical man concerned with quotas and schedules, told Baptiste to stop wasting time and get back to cutting cane. But Baptiste wasn't the only one who noticed. Over the next weeks, more workers reported the smell. It came and went with the wind, stronger in the mornings, fainter by afternoon. Some said it made their eyes water. Others complained of headaches when working the fields closest to the mountain. The plantation owners, secure in their great houses, dismissed these complaints as laziness, as attempts to avoid work. The mountain had always released a bit of sulfur here and there. It meant nothing. The harvest must continue. March arrived with its usual parade of religious festivals and social obligations. In Saint-Pierre, life continued its comfortable rhythm. Andreas Hirard, the shoemaker, noted in his diary that business was excellent. "Orders for Easter shoes keep me working late," he wrote on March 15th. "Marie complains I spend more time with leather than with her, but she smiles when she sees the money coming in." He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his cousin, who worked at a plantation near Morne Rouge, said the mountain had been grumbling. Such a curious word to use for a mountain. But then, people had always assigned personality to Pelée. The first earth tremors came so gently that many didn't notice them at all. A glass of water might show tiny ripples. A hanging lamp might sway almost imperceptibly. These weren't the violent shakes that the Caribbean knew from its occasional earthquakes. These were more like shivers, as if the island itself was waking from a long sleep, stretching muscles that hadn't moved in decades. Clara Prentice noticed them, though. Coming from Massachusetts, she wasn't accustomed to the earth moving at all. On March 20th, she wrote to her sister in Boston, "The strangest thing happened at tea yesterday. The cups rattled on their saucers, all by themselves. The servant girl said it was just the mountain settling, as if that was supposed to be reassuring. Thomas laughs at my nervousness and reminds me that we've survived worse. Remember the blizzard of '88? Still, there's something unsettling about the ground itself being unreliable." By late March, the tremors had become frequent enough that even the locals took notice. Not with alarm, not yet, but with the kind of mild interest reserved for unusual weather. The newspaper, Les Colonies, ran a small item on page 4 mentioning the minor seismic activity and assuring readers that such phenomena were common in volcanic regions and posed no danger. The editor, Marius Hirard, had consulted with the lycée's science teacher, who explained that dormant volcanoes often released pressure through small tremors and steam vents. Perfectly natural. Nothing to worry about. Then came April 2nd, a Wednesday, when Mount Pelée did something it hadn't done in living memory. It began to steam. Not the usual wisps of vapor that sometimes rose from the summit after rain, but real steam, a column of it, rising straight up in the still morning air. A planter named Gaston Land was the first to report it, riding into Saint-Pierre with news that sent a ripple of excitement. Yes, excitement through the city. Within hours, telescopes appeared on terraces and balconies throughout Saint-Pierre. The wealthy gathered on verandas to observe this curiosity through opera glasses. The steam column was white, almost pretty against the blue sky, like a giant's pipe smoke. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see the spectacle. Someone at the club suggested organizing an expedition to climb the mountain for a closer look. By April 23rd, that expedition had materialized. A group of young men from Saint-Pierre's social elite, armed with picnic baskets and bottles of rum, set out to climb Pelée. They wanted to peer into the crater to be able to boast that they'd looked into the mouth of a volcano. The expedition included Louis de Grotz, son of a wealthy merchant, and several of his friends from the lycée. They treated it as a grand adventure, a story to tell at parties. What they found at the summit disturbed them more than they cared to admit. The crater, which had been a peaceful lake for as long as anyone could remember, l'étang des palmistes, they called it, the lake of palm trees, was gone. In its place was a bubbling, steaming pit. The sulfur smell was overwhelming. The ground was hot to the touch in places. They didn't stay long. On the way down, de Groot noticed something else strange. The forest was full of snakes, far more than normal, and all heading downhill, away from the summit. The snakes. If there was a moment when the island's animals understood what the humans couldn't or wouldn't, it was in late April when the fer-de-lance began their exodus. The fer-de-lance is not a creature you want to encounter on a good day. 6 feet long, aggressive, and possessing venom that can kill a grown man in hours. They normally kept to the upper forests, avoiding human settlements. But now they came down the mountain in dozens, then hundreds. The first victims were horses and cattle in the fields. A plantation owner woke to find 3 of his best horses dead, their legs swollen with venom. Then came the human casualties. A child playing near a cane field, dead before the doctor could arrive. A woman hanging laundry, bitten on the ankle, dead by nightfall. The official count would eventually reach 50 deaths from snake bites in a single week, though the real number was probably higher. The poor, who couldn't afford doctors, often went uncounted. But it wasn't just the snakes. Every creature that could move was moving. Clouds of insects, ants, centipedes, spiders, streamed down the mountain slopes and into the city. People woke to find their homes invaded. Centipedes, some nearly a foot long, appeared in beds, in shoes, in cooking pots. The ants came in columns so thick they looked like dark rivers flowing down the streets. Birds abandoned their roosts on the mountain and wheeled overhead in massive, agitated flocks, their cries filling the air from dawn to dusk. The horses knew. That's what the stable hands would say later, those who survived. The horses knew something terrible was coming. Animals that had been docile for years became unmanageable. They kicked at their stalls, broke their tethers, refused to be saddled. Some had to be destroyed after injuring themselves trying to escape. Dogs howled through the night, an eerie, mournful sound that set everyone's nerves on edge. Cats disappeared entirely. One day they were there. The next, the city seemed empty of them. Governor Mouttet received reports of all this from his office in Saint-Pierre, and each report deepened his frown. Not because he feared the volcano, the scientists said there was no danger, but because he feared panic. The election was only weeks away. If people fled the city, if voting was disrupted, if the opposition party used the volcano as evidence of divine displeasure with the current administration, no, that couldn't be allowed to happen. He issued orders that all was well, that the government was monitoring the situation, that citizens should remain calm and go about their business. On April 25th, the rain of ash began. It started so gently that at first people thought it was dust, perhaps blown in from the Sahara. That happened sometimes. But this was different. This was gray and gritty, with a sulfur smell that made people cough. It covered everything, rooftops, streets, gardens like gray snow. Children tried to play in it until their parents, seeing their coughing fits, dragged them inside. Andreas Hurar wrote in his diary that evening, "The mountain is sick, I think." Or perhaps angry. The ash falls like rain that makes no sound. I've had to cover all my leather goods to protect them. The ash ruins everything it touches. My daughter's wedding dress, which she hung by the window, is gray now instead of white. She cried for an hour. I told her we would buy a new one. But the shops are all closing early. No one wants to be out in this. The Prentice family experienced the ash fall from their villa on the hill. Clara stood on the veranda, watching it drift down like some nightmare snowfall. It reminded her of winter in Boston, except wrong in every way. Warm instead of cold, gray instead of white, smelling of hell instead of clean winter air. Her children, initially delighted by this strange precipitation, soon began complaining of burning eyes and scratchy throats. Thomas, ever practical, ordered the servants to seal the windows and keep wet cloths over their faces when they had to go outside. But perhaps the most disturbing reaction came from those who still refused to see danger. At the clubs, at the cafes, educated men explained to anyone who would listen that this was all perfectly natural. Volcanoes released pressure this way. The ash was actually good for the soil. Next year's harvest would be magnificent. The snakes and insects were simply responding to natural changes in their habitat. There was no need for alarm, no need to disrupt the election, no need to evacuate. Mount Pelée had been dormant for half a century. It would return to sleep soon enough. The church took a different view. The cathedral began holding special masses, filled to capacity with people seeking divine explanation for these signs and portents. Was God angry with Saint-Pierre? The city had a reputation for libertine behavior, for its rum shops and dance halls, for the mixing of races in ways that scandalized more conservative colonies. Some preachers saw the mountain's awakening as a call to repentance. Others preached that God would protect the faithful, that the mountain was merely testing their faith. By the end of April, the entire northern end of Martinique lived under a pall of ash and anxiety. The plantation workers, closer to the earth and its rhythms, began abandoning the fields despite threats from overseers. They headed south, away from the mountain, carrying their few possessions and spreading tales of the horror on the slopes. Dead animals everywhere, trees dying, streams running black with ash. The wealthy, however, stayed. They had too much invested in Saint-Pierre to leave. Businesses, properties, social positions. Besides, the governor had announced that a scientific commission would investigate the volcano and provide a proper assessment. Surely these learned men would put an end to the hysteria. The election must proceed. Commerce must continue. Saint-Pierre had survived hurricanes, earthquakes, and epidemics. It would survive this, too. On the last night of April, the mountain glowed red. Not continuously, but in pulses, like a giant heart beating with fire. People gathered on rooftops and balconies to watch this terrible beauty. Some said it looked like the gates of hell had opened. Others insisted it was just the reflection of lava on steam clouds, nothing more. The children were sent to bed early, but many lay awake listening to their parents' worried whispers and the strange rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The animals continued their exodus. By now, the Fer-de-Lance invasion had become so severe that the governor authorized payment for dead snakes, 10 centimes per head. Hunters went out with clubs and machetes, killing dozens, but more kept coming. It was as if the mountain was emptying itself of every living thing, sending them down as refugees from some approaching catastrophe that only they could sense. The stable hand was right. The horses knew. The snakes knew. Every creature with instincts unmarred by civilization knew. But the people of Saint-Pierre, wrapped in the confidence of the 20th century, in their faith in science and progress and colonial authority, convinced themselves that knowledge and civilization would protect them from the ancient forces stirring beneath their feet. The mountain was no longer sleeping. It was gathering itself, building pressure, preparing for a violence that would eclipse anything in the recorded history of volcanic disasters. And still, the governor insisted, the election would proceed as planned. Part 3. The Week of Warnings. April the 27th was the day the sun didn't rise. Not properly, anyway. The people of Saint-Pierre woke to darkness. a thick, oppressive gloom that should have lifted with the dawn but didn't. The ashfall had intensified during the night, and now it hung in the air like a curtain, turning the tropical morning into something from an Arctic winter. Street lamps that had been extinguished at dawn had to be relit. Roosters, confused by the perpetual twilight, crowed at random times throughout the day. Andreas Hurard tried to open his shop that morning, but gave up by noon. No customers came. The streets were nearly deserted, except for shapes moving through the gray haze like ghosts. He wrote, "It feels like the end of the world. The ash is everywhere, in our food, in our water, in our lungs. Every breath tastes of sulfur. My wife weeps as she tries to clean, but it's useless. As soon as she wipes a surface, it's gray again. We live now in a colorless world." The rivers told their own story of what was happening on the mountain. The Rivière Blanche, which normally ran clear and cold from Pelée's slopes, had turned into something monstrous. The water was hot, actually hot, and black with ash. Dead fish floated on the surface by the thousands, their white bellies facing the gray sky. The smell of rotting fish mixed with sulfur created a stench that made people retch. Children who usually played by the riverside were kept indoors, staring out windows at a world transformed. A plantation owner named Auguste Siparis, not to be confused with the prisoner Ludger Silberus, sent a frantic message to the governor. His workers had fled after finding the stream that irrigated his fields was too hot to touch. The sugarcane was dying, he reported. The very earth seemed to be cooking from below. He begged for guidance, for reassurance, for anything that might explain what was happening to their world. Governor Moutet's response was swift and decisive, though not in the way Siparis had hoped. The governor was focused on one thing: maintaining order until the election on May 11th. He summoned the editor of Les Colonies and made it clear that any reporting that might cause panic would be considered sedition. The newspaper would emphasize the temporary nature of the volcanic activity. It would highlight the opinions of experts who saw no danger. It would, above all, reassure the population that the government had everything under control. But controlling the narrative became harder when, on the night of May 2nd, Mount Pelée began to glow with a fierce red light. This wasn't the intermittent pulsing of previous nights. This was a sustained, angry glow that lit up the entire northern sky. In Saint-Pierre, people stood in the streets despite the falling ash, mesmerized by the terrible beauty of it. The mountain looked like a giant forge, as if the gods were crafting something terrible in its depths. Clara Prentice stood with her husband on their terrace, watching the display. "Thomas," she said quietly, "we need to leave. Tomorrow. Tonight, if possible." Thomas Prentice, successful businessman, rational man of the world, shook his head. "The governor has assembled a scientific commission. They'll evaluate the situation properly. We can't just abandon everything based on superstition and fear." "This isn't superstition," Clara insisted, pulling her shawl tighter against the ash-laden air. "This is the earth itself telling us to run." "And go where?" Thomas asked. "Fort-de-France is overcrowded with refugees already. Our business is here. Our life is here. We'll wait for the scientific report." The scientific commission that Thomas Prentice and so many others put their faith in was led by Professor Gaston Landis, the same planner who had first reported the steam column. He was joined by the science teacher from the lycée, a pharmacist with an interest in chemistry, and two other local notables who claimed some knowledge of natural phenomena. They were not volcanologists. That science was still in its infancy, but they were educated men, and in the colonial hierarchy, that was enough. On May 3rd, this commission made its fatal assessment. After observing the volcano from what they considered a safe distance, they concluded that Saint-Pierre was in no immediate danger. The configuration of the valleys, they said, would channel any lava flows away from the city. The crater was positioned such that any explosion would be directed upward, not outward. Their report, published prominently in Les Colonies, stated with confidence, "The safety of Saint-Pierre is absolutely assured." That same day, as if to mock this scientific certainty, Mount Pelée demonstrated what it thought of human assessments. A massive mud flow, what volcanologists would later call a lahar, broke free from the mountain slopes. It was a river of boiling mud, ash, and boulders, moving with the speed of a galloping horse and the force of 1,000 battering rams. Its target, the Guérin sugar factory. The Guérin factory was one of the largest on the island, employing over 150 workers during the harvest season. They had just begun the morning shift when someone spotted the mud flow coming down the mountainside. There was screaming, running, chaos, but nowhere to run to. The mud flow was too fast, too wide. It struck the factory with such force that the building exploded as if hit by dynamite. The boiling mud engulfed everything: buildings, machinery, people. In less than 3 minutes, 150 human beings were dead, buried under tons of steaming volcanic debris. A handful of survivors, those who had been on the edges of the disaster, stumbled into Saint-Pierre with tales of horror. They described the sound, like 1,000 trains arriving at once. They described the heat that scorched their skin even from a distance. They described the screams that were cut short so suddenly it was as if God himself had silenced them. The destruction of the Guérin factory sent waves of panic through the countryside. Now the exodus toward Saint-Pierre became a flood. Thousands of plantation workers, small farmers, and their families packed the roads leading to the city. They came with carts piled high with possessions, with children on their shoulders, with elderly parents who could barely walk. They came seeking safety in the city's stone buildings, in its distance from the mountain, in the presence of government authority. Saint-Pierre's population swelled from 30,000 to nearly 40,000 in a matter of days. Every church, every public building, every space that could offer shelter was packed with refugees. The markets ran out of food. The fountains ran dry as the ash contaminated the water supply. The city's infrastructure, already strained by the ashfall, began to collapse under the weight of this human tide. Governor Mouttet saw this influx not as a humanitarian crisis, but as a political one. If people were fleeing to Saint-Pierre, they couldn't flee from it, not without making his administration look incompetent, not without disrupting the election. He made a decision that would haunt history. He posted troops on the roads leading south out of the city with orders to turn back anyone trying to leave. Saint-Pierre was safe, he declared. The Scientific Commission had said so. Anyone spreading panic or attempting to flee was acting against the interest of public order. The governor's own wife arrived from Fort-de-France on May 5th, a gesture meant to show confidence. If the governor's family was in Saint-Pierre, surely it must be safe. She brought their children, dressed in their finest clothes, and made a point of being seen shopping in the city's elite stores. The message was clear. Life continues as normal. But nothing was normal. The ash now lay feet deep in some places. Roofs were collapsing under its weight. The darkness during daylight hours was so complete that people carried lanterns at noon. The thunder from the mountain was constant now, a bass rumble that made conversation difficult and sleep impossible. Birds fell from the sky, their lungs clogged with ash. Dogs wandered the streets, abandoned by owners who had fled or died, howling at the burning mountain. Marius Herard, the newspaper editor, found himself in an impossible position. He knew the danger was real. His own brother had fled the city, but the governor's orders were explicit. His editorials became masterpieces of doublespeak, acknowledging the temporary inconveniences while assuring readers that authorities are monitoring the situation closely. He would later write, in a letter that survived because he sent it to a colleague in Fort-de-France, "I write lies that may kill thousands. But if I write the truth, I will be arrested, and the lies will be written by another. God forgive me." The churches were doing booming business in salvation. Special masses were held around the clock. Confessionals had lines stretching into the streets. Father Alta Roche of the cathedral worked 18-hour days, offering last rites, baptizing children whose parents feared they wouldn't live to see them grow, marrying couples who wanted to face the end together. He wrote in the church records, "The faithful believe the last days have come. I cannot tell them they are wrong." On the evening of May 4th, Clara Prentice made one final attempt to convince her husband to leave. She had packed secretly, had even arranged for a carriage to take them to a ship in the harbor. But when she told Thomas, he grew angry, the first time she had ever seen him truly furious. "You would have us run like cowards?" he shouted. "Abandon everything we've built here? And based on what? The ravings of superstitious natives. The government says we're safe. The scientists say we're safe. We're staying." Clara looked at him for a long moment, this man she had loved for 15 years, this rational, intelligent man who couldn't see what was right in front of him. "Then we'll die here," she said quietly. "Don't be melodramatic," Thomas replied, already regretting his anger. "In a week, this will all be over, and we'll laugh about your fears." That night, the mountain's glow was brighter than ever. The ashfall was so heavy that breathing became difficult even indoors. The rumbling was now accompanied by explosions that shook buildings and shattered windows. Lightning played constantly around the summit, but this wasn't normal lightning. It was red and purple, and moved in ways that defied nature. Andreas Hurard made his last diary entry that night. "The governor says we are safe, but the governor is a fool. The mountain will kill us all. I think of my daughter's wedding, planned for the end of May. She has already left with her fiancé's family. Smart girl, smarter than her father, who stays to protect his little shop, his leather goods that will all be ash soon. If anyone reads this after..." The entry ends there, mid-sentence. Perhaps the lamp went out. Perhaps the ash made it too hard to breathe. Perhaps he simply had nothing more to say. By the morning of May 5th, Saint-Pierre was a city under siege by the earth itself. The warnings had been clear, escalating, undeniable. But the combination of political calculation, scientific incompetence, and human nature's tendency to normalize even the most abnormal situations had created a trap. 40,000 people were now locked in a dying city, with a governor who refused to let them leave and a mountain that was about to show them all the true meaning of power. Part 4. The Final 3 Days. May 5th, 1902. A Monday. In any other year, it would have been an ordinary day in the life of Saint-Pierre. Shops opening, ships loading sugar and rum, children walking to school. But on this Monday, ordinary had become a memory. The city woke, if anyone had actually slept through the mountain's constant roaring, to find the streets carpeted with dead birds. Thousands of them, their small bodies covered in gray ash, looking like stones, scattered by some careless giant. The morning brought fresh horror. Around 10 o'clock, another mud flow broke free from Pelée's slopes, this time racing down the Rivière Blanche toward the coast. Its target was the Usine Guérin rum distillery, one of the few industrial operations still attempting to function. The owner had kept his workers on site, promising triple wages to those who stayed. 25 men had taken that offer. They were loading barrels when someone spotted the wall of boiling mud descending the valley. There was no time to run. The mud flow hit the distillery with enough force to shatter stone walls 3 feet thick. The rum barrels exploded in the heat, creating fireballs that could be seen from Saint-Pierre. The entire complex was buried in seconds under 30 feet of steaming volcanic debris. Of the 25 workers, not one survived. Their bodies were never recovered. They became part of the landscape, entombed forever in the solidified mud. But the mud flow didn't stop at the distillery. It continued to the sea, pushing a wall of water before it. The ocean, which had been strangely calm all morning, suddenly pulled back from the shore, exposing the seafloor for hundreds of yards. Fish flopped on the exposed sand. Children who had never seen such a thing started to run toward this strange new beach. But their parents, recognizing the signs of a tsunami, screamed for them to get back. The water returned in a wave 15 feet high. It wasn't one of the great tsunamis that can destroy entire coastlines, but it was enough. The wave swept through the lower streets of Saint-Pierre, flooding warehouses, overturning market stalls, drowning those too slow or too surprised to escape. When it receded, it left behind a city even more traumatized, if such a thing was possible. In the harbor, ship captains who had been debating whether to leave made their decisions. The Italian ship Orsolina, under Captain Marino Leboeuf, prepared to depart despite not having finished loading its cargo. But when Leboeuf requested clearance to leave, he was told that the harbor had been closed by order of the governor. No ships could leave. It would cause panic, undermine confidence. The election was in 6 days. Order must be maintained. The captain of the Roraima, a Canadian ship, was more diplomatic but equally frustrated. He sent a message to the shipping company. Situation here unprecedented. Mountain in constant eruption. City covered in ash. Request permission to leave immediately. The response came back. Complete loading. Await further instructions. Corporate profits, like political concerns, took precedence over human life. Underwater, something else was happening. The telegraph cables that connected Martinique to the outside world began breaking, one by one. The heat from underwater volcanic vents was melting the protective coating, causing short circuits, severing communications. By evening of May 5th, only one cable remained functional, and messages had to be prioritized. Business telegrams, government communications, military dispatches, all took precedence over personal messages. Families trying to contact loved ones found their telegrams unsent, stacked in piles that would never be transmitted. May 6th dawned. If dawn is the right word for a day that never really became bright. The ashfall was now so heavy that people used umbrellas indoors to protect themselves from the constant gray rain that filtered through every crack, every gap in the roofs. The umbrellas, of course, quickly became so heavy with ash that they collapsed. But for a few minutes, they provided an illusion of protection. The livestock were dying. Horses stood in the fields with their heads hanging low, their breathing labored and wheezing. Cattle lay down and didn't get up again. Chickens huddled in corners, their feathers so clogged with ash they couldn't fly. A farmer named Jean-Baptiste Duval later testified, he was one of the few rural witnesses to survive, that he watched his entire herd of goats die within an hour, their lungs simply giving out from the toxic air. The human casualties were mounting too, though not from the volcano directly. Not yet. Heart attacks among the elderly who couldn't handle the stress, crushing injuries from collapsing roofs, respiratory failure in those with weak lungs. The hospital was overwhelmed. The Sisters of St. Paul worked without rest, but there were too many patients, too few beds, and no real treatment for lungs full of volcanic ash. The bishop, Monseigneur Gabriel Parel, declared a day of special prayer. The cathedral, despite its roof creaking ominously under the weight of ash, was packed for every service. People who hadn't attended church in years crowded in, kneeling in the aisles, clutching rosaries with ash-covered fingers. The bishop himself led the prayers, his voice competing with the constant thunder from the mountain. God tests us, he told his congregation, as he tested Job, as he tested the Israelites in the desert. We must not lose faith. We must not give in to fear. The government assures us we are safe. We must trust in God and in the authorities he has placed over us. Later in private, the bishop would confide to his secretary that he had considered evacuating the church's orphanage, but was told by the governor that such an action would be unhelpful to public morale. 73 children remained in the orphanage. The bishop spent that night in prayer, not for the city's salvation, but for forgiveness for his cowardice in not defying the governor's orders. In the afternoon of May 6th, something strange happened in the animal world. All the dogs in Saint-Pierre began howling at once. Not barking, not the normal sounds dogs make, but a synchronized, mournful howling that lasted for nearly an hour. It was so unnerving that some people later said it was worse than the mountains roaring. At least the volcano was understandable, geological. This coordinated animal behavior spoke of something deeper, more primitive, a knowledge that transcended human understanding. The governor's wife, who had arrived just the day before to demonstrate confidence, spent May 6th making very public appearances. She visited the market, such as it was with half the stalls abandoned. She attended a reception at the club where the city's elite gathered to pretend that civilization still functioned. She smiled. She chatted about Parisian fashion. She sipped champagne that tasted of sulfur and ash. My husband assures me, she told anyone who would listen, that the mountain will quiet soon. These manifestations are simply the volcano releasing pressure, like a pot letting off steam. Soon it will settle, and we'll all have such stories to tell. No one had the courage to ask her why. If it was so safe, the governor had found it necessary to post soldiers to prevent people from leaving. That evening, the last functional telegraph cable carried a message from the mayor of Saint-Pierre to the governor, who had temporarily relocated to Fort-de-France to better coordinate the response. The message read, "Situation desperate. Population in state of panic. Requesting immediate evacuation authorization." The response came within an hour. Evacuation unnecessary and counterproductive. Maintain order. Election proceeds as scheduled. May 7th, the last full day of Saint-Pierre's existence. It began with what seemed like good news. The ash fall had decreased slightly. Optimists took this as a sign that the eruption was ending. The pessimists, and by now they were the majority, saw it as the calm before the storm. The reduction in ash allowed people to see the mountain clearly for the first time in days, and what they saw was terrifying. The entire upper portion of Pelée was bare, stripped of vegetation, glowing with heat even in daylight. Massive rocks could be seen being ejected from the crater, flying through the air like pebbles thrown by a child. The sound was different, too, less roaring, more rhythmic, like giant breathing or a massive heart beating. In the city, final preparations were being made, though for what? No one could say. Some families packed their valuables, ready to flee at a moment's notice, soldiers or no soldiers. Others had given up, sitting in their homes waiting for whatever would come. The shops that remained open sold out of food within hours. The bakeries had stopped functioning. The ovens couldn't compete with the heat already in the air. It was on this last day that Ludger Silbaris, sometimes called Louis Auguste Siparis in different accounts, made the decision that would save his life through pure accident. Silbaris was a laborer, known for his drinking and occasional brawling. On the night of May 7th, he got spectacularly drunk, perhaps to forget the horror around him, perhaps in celebration of still being alive. He got into a fight, broke a window, and was arrested by police who were still, remarkably, maintaining some semblance of law and order. The jail was full of looters and panic-driven criminals, so Silbaris was thrown into the solitary confinement cell, a stone dungeon partially underground, with walls 3 feet thick and only a small grated window facing away from the mountain. It was considered the worst cell in the jail, reserved for the most violent criminals. Silbaris protested, said he was just drunk, not dangerous, but the guards had no patience for arguments. They threw him in and locked the door. That decision, born of irritation and overcrowding, would make him one of only 2, possibly 3, confirmed survivors of what was coming. As night fell on May 7th, families throughout Saint-Pierre gathered together. Parents held children closer than usual. Husbands and wives who had been arguing about whether to flee made peace with their decisions. In the Prentice household, Clara had stopped trying to convince Thomas to leave. She spent the evening reading to her children their favorite stories from home, while volcanic lightning turned the sky purple and red outside their windows. In his shop, Andreas Hurar had given up any pretense of normal business. His final action, according to his nephew, who survived because he had left days earlier, was to take his finest piece of work, a pair of boots he had been crafting for the mayor, and place them in his iron safe, along with his diary and a photograph of his family. Perhaps he hoped these items would survive, even if he didn't. The priests worked through the night, offering last rites to anyone who wanted them. The lines stretched around the cathedral. Father Alta Roche later estimated, in a letter sent to Fort-de-France that morning, that he had performed last rites for over 300 people in those final hours. "They know," he wrote. "Whatever the governor says, whatever the scientists claim, the people know death is coming." The last telegraph message from Saint-Pierre was sent at 11:30 p.m. on May 7th. It was from the telegrapher to his colleague in Fort-de-France. "Mountain worse than ever. People praying in streets. God help us." The cable went dead immediately after. The last link between Saint-Pierre and the outside world was severed. As midnight passed and May 8th began, the mountain seemed to quiet slightly. The constant roaring diminished to a rumble. The red glow remained, but seemed less angry. Some took this as a hopeful sign. Others recognized it for what volcanologists would later understand: the mountain drawing breath before its final scream. In homes throughout the city, people tried to sleep. Children whimpered in their beds. Adults sat in chairs, unable to close their eyes, watching the windows for any sign of dawn or disaster, whichever came first. In the harbor, sailors on watch noted the unnatural stillness of the water, the way the air seemed to press down with physical weight, the way even the rats had gone quiet. In his dungeon cell, Ludger Silbaris curled up on the stone floor, drunk and miserable, unaware that these thick walls that seemed like a curse would, in 7 hours and 52 minutes, become his salvation. The city of Saint-Pierre entered its final night, wrapped in ash and fear, its people trapped between a mountain that wouldn't stop burning and a government that wouldn't let them flee. They had received every warning nature could provide, had seen death approach in increments: the sulfur, the snakes, the ash, the mud flows, the boiling rivers. Now, in these last hours, there were no more warnings to give. The mountain had said everything it needed to say. At 7:52 a.m., it would speak one final time. Part 5. 3 minutes to hell. Dawn on Ascension Day came quietly to Saint-Pierre, or as quietly as anything could come, to a city that had been holding its breath for a week. The church bells that normally would have begun ringing at 6 o'clock stayed silent. The bell ringers had fled or were too exhausted to climb the ash-laden steps. But habit is a powerful force, and despite everything, the city began its morning routines. In the bakery on Rue Bouillet, Joseph Marode had somehow managed to light his ovens before dawn. Not to bake bread, flour was too precious and contaminated with ash, but to warm the small group of neighbors who had gathered there, finding comfort in the familiar space even if it could no longer serve its purpose. They sat on flour sacks, sharing the last of the rum, talking in low voices about nothing important because the important things were too terrible to discuss. At the customs house, Léon Compere-Leandre, a shoemaker like Andreas Hurrah, had arrived early to settle a debt with one of the clerks before the man left on a ship, if ships were ever allowed to leave again. He would later describe the morning as oddly peaceful. The mountain quieter than it had been in days, the ashfall reduced to a light dusting. It felt, he would say, like the world was holding its breath. In the cathedral, Father Alta Roche was preparing for the Ascension Day service. Despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, he expected the church to be full. He arranged the communion wafers, filled the chalices with wine that tasted of sulfur, and tried not to think about the fact that this might be the last Mass he would ever perform. The altar boys, those few whose families hadn't fled, arrived looking hollow-eyed and frightened. He blessed them each personally, his hands trembling slightly as he made the sign of the cross on their foreheads. The Prentice family woke slowly in their villa on the hill. Clara had barely slept, spending most of the night watching the mountains glow through the window. The children were fretful, complaining of headaches from the bad air. Thomas dressed carefully in his best suit, as if normalcy could be maintained through proper appearance. "We'll attend the service," he told Clara. "Show the staff that we're not afraid. Then we'll see what the day brings." In the harbor, the sailors on the morning watch noticed something odd. The water, which had been disturbed all night by strange currents and bubbles of gas rising from below, had gone completely still, mirror flat. The Roraima's first mate would later testify that he could see the mountain's reflection in the water so clearly it looked like Pelée was both above and below them, as if they were trapped between two volcanoes. At 7:50 a.m., the telegrapher at Fort-de-France received a message from the military outpost on the hills above Saint-Pierre. "Mountain appears to be settling. Ash fall minimal. Request instructions for—" The message cut off mid-sentence. It would be the last communication from the region for days. At 7:51 a.m., people throughout Saint-Pierre were engaged in the ordinary acts of an extraordinary morning. A mother was braiding her daughter's hair, working ash out of the dark strands. A shopkeeper was sweeping ash from his doorstep for the 100th time. A priest was lighting candles that kept guttering in the sulphurous air. The governor's wife was drinking coffee that tasted of smoke and trying not to show her fear to the servants. At 7:52 a.m., Mount Pelée exploded. But exploded is too simple a word for what happened. The mountain didn't just blow its top like Vesuvius or Krakatoa. Instead, the entire south-facing side of the volcano split open, like a dam bursting, releasing a cloud of superheated gas and volcanic material that scientists would later call a pyroclastic surge or nuée ardente, a glowing cloud. The temperature of this cloud was over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It moved at a speed later calculated at 400 miles per hour. It was denser than water, but flowed like a gas, defying the normal laws of physics that govern how matter should behave. From the moment of the explosion to the moment the pyroclastic surge reached the sea was approximately 3 minutes, 180 seconds for a city to die. In the first second, the sound reached Saint-Pierre. Not a boom, but a crack like the world splitting apart. Windows shattered throughout the city, not from the sound, but from the pressure wave that preceded it. Birds in flight were slammed to the ground. People standing were knocked to their knees. In the first 10 seconds, those who could see the mountain witnessed something that the human mind could barely process. A wall of darkness racing down the slope, not flowing like lava, but flying like a solid cloud, eating the distance between the crater and the city at impossible speed. Some tried to run. Others stood frozen, their minds unable to accept what their eyes were seeing. In the first 30 seconds, the pyroclastic surge had covered half the distance to Saint-Pierre. The plantation houses on the upper slopes were engulfed and erased as if they had never existed. Trees weren't knocked down. They were vaporized, leaving only charred stumps. The very air ahead of the surge heated to lethal temperatures. Birds fell from the sky already dead, cooked in flight. At 45 seconds, people in Saint-Pierre could feel the heat approaching, though the surge itself was still a mile away. The air became impossible to breathe, not from ash, but from the temperature. Those who gasped pulled superheated air into their lungs, searing the delicate tissue instantly. Blood vessels in the lungs burst. People began dying before the surge even reached them, drowning in their own blood. At 1 minute, the leading edge of the pyroclastic surge hit the upper districts of Saint-Pierre. Buildings didn't burn. They exploded from thermal shock. Stone walls 3 feet thick shattered like glass. Metal lampposts melted and bent like rubber. The surge didn't flow around obstacles. It went through them, over them, its momentum unstoppable. At 1 minute and 30 seconds, the surge reached the city center. The cathedral's spire, which had stood for 60 years, was snapped off like a twig. The great bell, weighing over a ton, was ripped from its mounting and hurled 500 meters through the air. The theater, that symbol of Saint-Pierre's sophistication, was reduced to rubble in an instant. The windows didn't just break. The glass liquefied, turning into deadly projectiles of molten silica. At this moment, in the city, human bodies were subjected to forces no living thing could survive. The heat was so intense that clothing didn't have time to burn. It vaporized, leaving skin exposed to temperatures that caused instant third-degree burns. Fat under the skin boiled. Blood turned to steam in veins, causing bodies to swell and burst. Brain tissue, protected by the skull, cooked inside the bone, expanding until the pressure cracked heads open like eggs. But perhaps the most merciful aspect of this horror was its speed. Death came so fast that the nervous system didn't have time to register pain. People died in the positions they had been in when the surge hit, sitting at tables, standing in doorways, kneeling in prayer. A mother was found days later, still holding her baby, both turned to charcoal but maintaining their final embrace. At 2 minutes, the surge reached the harbor. The ships that had been prevented from leaving met their fate. The Roraima was capsized instantly, its steel hull no protection against the heat. Sailors on deck were incinerated where they stood. Those below deck had a few more seconds, long enough to realize something terrible was happening, not long enough to do anything about it. The water around the ships boiled, turning the harbor into a cauldron. The Italian ship Orsolina burst into flames before the surge even touched it, the heat igniting everything combustible from a distance. Captain Leboeuf, who had wanted so desperately to leave, died at his post, his hands melted to the ship's wheel. At 2 minutes and 30 seconds, the pyroclastic surge hit the sea itself, turning water instantly to steam, creating a secondary explosion that sent a massive cloud of vapor into the sky. The surge continued over the water's surface for nearly a mile before finally losing its momentum and collapsing into the Caribbean. By 3 minutes, it was over. The city of Saint-Pierre had ceased to exist. Where there had been buildings, there was now rubble. Where there had been trees, there were only blackened stumps. Where there had been people, there were statues of carbon that had once been human. The air itself was toxic, filled with gases that would kill anyone who breathed them. The ground was covered in ash and pumice to a depth of several feet, still hot enough to burn through shoe leather. In the immediate aftermath, there was no sound except the hissing of cooling rock and the crash of collapsing buildings that had remained standing for a few seconds before their weakened structures gave way. No screams, no cries for help, no moaning of the wounded. The silence was absolute because there was no one left to break it. Or almost no one. In his dungeon cell, Ludger Silbaris was thrown against the wall by the force of the explosion. The superheated air entered through the small grated window, burning his back and arms terribly, but the thick stone walls protected him from the worst of it. He held his breath as long as he could, then breathed through his shirt, the fabric filtering out some of the killing heat. He would remain in that cell for 4 days before rescue came, drinking his own urine to survive, calling out periodically in hope someone would hear. Léon Compere-Leandre, the shoemaker who had been at the customs house, survived through a quirk of topography. He was in a basement room that was partially shielded by a hill. The surge passed over him rather than through him. He was burned terribly, but not fatally. When he emerged, he couldn't understand what he was seeing. The city he had known his entire life was gone, replaced by a moonscape of ash and destruction. There may have been a third survivor, a young girl named Havivra da Ifrile, who was found days later in a boat, burned and delirious. She claimed to have been near the shore when the surge hit, thrown into the water by the force of it, protected from the worst of the heat by being underwater. Her account was confused, her memories fragmentary. And some historians doubt whether she was actually in Saint-Pierre during the eruption or arrived later. But for the others, the 30,000 residents and the 10,000 refugees who had sought safety in the city, there was no survival. They died in those 3 minutes, victims of a force that human beings in 1902 could barely comprehend. The governor who had prevented evacuation, his wife who had come to show confidence, the scientists who had declared the city safe, the families who had trusted their leaders, the workers who had nowhere else to go, all were equal in those final moments. The mountain had given every warning it could. The sulfur smells, the earthquakes, the ash falls, the mud flows, the animal exodus, nature had screamed its danger in every language it possessed. But human concerns, politics, economics, social standing, normalcy bias, had translated those screams into whispers, had rationalized the irrational, had found reasons to stay when every instinct should have said run. In 3 minutes, one of the Caribbean's greatest cities had become a tomb. The Paris of the West Indies was now just smoking rubble and silence. The election that Governor Mouttet had been so concerned about would never happen. The cathedral bells that had marked the hours for generations would never ring again. The children who should have grown up to carry on the life of the city were now ash among the ash. The pyroclastic surge dissipated over the sea, its energy finally spent. The mountain continued to smoke, smaller eruptions following the main blast, But the worst was over. There was no one left to kill. Saint-Pierre was already gone, erased in 3 minutes that would echo through history as a reminder of nature's ultimate authority over human ambition. Part 6. The Impossible Survivors. In the immediate aftermath of the eruption, Saint-Pierre existed in a state that was neither life nor death, but something in between, a liminal space where the laws of normal existence had been suspended. The city was gone, but its echo remained in the form of thousands of human shapes, frozen in their final moments, transformed into statues of carbon and ash. Lugger Silbaris didn't know any of this. In his dungeon cell, he knew only darkness, pain, and confusion. The explosion had thrown him against the stone wall with such force that he initially thought the prison was being bombarded. Then came the heat, a searing wave of superheated air that entered through the small grated window, the only opening to the outside world. He had turned his back to it instinctively, and that instinct saved his life. The burns across his back and arms were severe, the skin blistering and peeling immediately. But the thick stone walls absorbed most of the heat that would have killed him instantly. For the first hour, he called out, thinking surely the guards would come, would let him out, would explain what had happened. His voice echoed in the stone chamber, answered only by silence. Not even the usual sounds of the city penetrated the walls. No voices, no cartwheels on cobblestones, no church bells. Just an oppressive, absolute quiet that was somehow more terrifying than any noise could have been. The cell was completely dark. The window that faced away from the mountain and had saved his life now admitted no light, blocked by debris and ash. Silbaris felt his way around the familiar space, 4 steps by 4 steps, the rough stone walls his only reference points in the darkness. The air was thick and hard to breathe, tasting of sulfur and something else, something burned and wrong that he couldn't identify. As the hours passed, thirst became his primary torment. The heat had dehydrated him severely, and his burned skin wept fluid he couldn't afford to lose. By the second day, though he had no way to know it was the second day in that eternal darkness, he was drinking his own urine, forcing himself to swallow the bitter liquid, because the alternative was death. He rationed it carefully, some primitive part of his mind understanding that rescue might be days away, if it came at all. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, but in an entirely different world of survival, Léon Compere-Leandre was experiencing his own version of hell. When the pyroclastic surge had passed over the customs house, he had been in a basement storage room counting inventory. The building above him had been destroyed instantly, but the basement, partially protected by a fold in the terrain, had remained intact enough to shelter him from the worst of the heat. When he emerged, crawling through a gap in the collapsed ceiling, he couldn't process what he was seeing. Where the customs house had stood, there was rubble. Where the street had been, there was a field of ash several feet deep, still hot enough to burn through his shoes. And where there should have been people, his colleagues, his friends, the merchants he dealt with daily, there were shapes that his mind refused to recognize as human. Compere-Leandre would later describe walking through the destroyed city as like being in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. Bodies were everywhere, but they didn't look like bodies. They looked like statues or mannequins, or the plaster casts archaeologists make of cavities in volcanic ash. A woman sat on what had been a doorstep, her hands folded in her lap, looking almost peaceful except she was charcoal. A man stood against a wall, one hand raised as if to shield his face, frozen forever in that gesture of futile protection. The heat was still overwhelming. The ground burned his feet even through what remained of his shoes. The air was toxic, making him cough and retch. His own burns, which covered much of his legs and arms, screamed with every movement. But he walked, driven by some instinct beyond conscious thought, heading away from the mountain, toward where he remembered the sea should be. He found other survivors, briefly. Near what had been the marketplace, he discovered a young woman, terribly burned but still breathing. She died as he tried to help her last words incomprehensible, her eyes reflecting a horror that words couldn't capture. An old man trapped under a beam lived long enough to beg for water that Compere-Leandre didn't have. A child, he couldn't tell if it was a boy or girl, took 3 gasping breaths and then was still. By the time Compere-Leandre reached the edge of the destruction zone, hours after the eruption, he had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. He collapsed on a hill overlooking what had been Saint-Pierre, his mind finally accepting what his eyes had been telling him. The city was gone. Not damaged, not burning, but erased. Where 40,000 people had lived and worked and loved, there was now only smoking rubble and silence. The first rescue attempts came from the sea. Ships that had been far enough away to survive the eruption approached the harbor cautiously, their crews unable to believe what they were seeing. The captain of the French cruiser Suchet, which had been anchored at Fort-de-France, arrived in the afternoon of May 8th. His log entry for that day reads with military terseness that barely conceals the horror. Saint-Pierre no longer exists. No survivors visible. Shore too hot for landing parties. Awaiting orders. The heat was indeed the first obstacle. The pyroclastic surge had superheated everything it touched, and the ground remained hot enough to burn for days after the eruption. The first rescue parties that tried to enter the city had to turn back, their shoes smoking, their faces blistered just from proximity to the still cooling earth. They reported that the air itself seemed to burn, that breathing was difficult not just from ash but from the temperature. It wasn't until May 9th, more than 24 hours after the eruption, that rescue parties could penetrate deeply into the ruins. What they found defied description, though many tried. A French journalist named Georges Hébert, who arrived with one of the first rescue teams, wrote, "We walked through streets we could no longer recognize, guided only by the general slope of the land toward the sea. Every few steps, we encountered what had been a person, now a blackened statue. They were everywhere, in doorways, in the streets, in what had been gardens. Some were alone, others in groups. Families, perhaps, huddled together. The positions of the bodies told the story of those final seconds. Many were found in running positions, though they hadn't gotten far. Others were discovered in their beds, killed so quickly they never woke up. In the cathedral, they found the congregation still in their pews, row upon row of carbonized figures, with their heads bowed as if in prayer. The priest was at the altar, his arms raised in benediction, frozen in the act of blessing his flock. The rescue parties had to work in shifts, not just because of the heat, but because of the psychological toll. Hardened soldiers who had seen battlefield casualties broke down at the sight of children, turned to charcoal, still clutching their toys. The silence was oppressive, no wounded to help, no voices calling for rescue, just the crunch of footsteps on ash and the occasional crash of a wall finally giving way. It was on May 11th, the day the election would have been held, that they heard the voice. A rescue party was picking through the ruins of the jail when someone heard what sounded like singing. Faint, hoarse, but definitely human. They traced it to a small window at ground level, partially buried in ash and debris. When they cleared it and looked inside, they found themselves staring at Lugger Silbaris, still alive in his dungeon cell 4 days after the eruption. Getting him out required hours of work. The door was buried under tons of rubble, and the walls were too thick to break through easily. Finally, they managed to clear enough debris to force the door open. Silberus emerged like Lazarus from the tomb, burned, dehydrated, barely able to walk, but alive. The rescue workers couldn't believe it. In a city where everyone had died in seconds, this drunk who had been thrown in solitary confinement had survived. The journalists who arrived to document the disaster immediately seized on Silberus's story. Here was a miracle in the midst of catastrophe, a sign that God's mercy could find its way even into hell. The fact that he had survived because he was a criminal, locked in a cell for drunken brawling, added an ironic twist that writers couldn't resist. Within weeks, his story had spread around the world. Léon Compere-Leandre, who had made his own way to safety, was initially less celebrated. His survival seemed more explainable. He had been in a protected location, had managed to escape the worst of the heat. But as investigators pieced together the pattern of destruction, they realized his survival was just as miraculous. The customs house where he had been was well within the kill zone. By all rights, he should have died with everyone else. The possible third survivor, Havivre da Ifrile, remained a mystery. She was found by a rescue boat 2 days after the eruption, floating in a small craft, severely burned and delirious. She claimed to have been thrown into the water by the force of the blast, protected from the heat by being submerged. But her memories were fragmentary, confused by trauma and fever. Some witnesses said they had seen her in Fort-de-France the day before the eruption. Others swore she had been in Saint-Pierre. The truth was never definitively established. As more rescue parties arrived and the full scope of the disaster became clear, they found stories frozen in ash throughout the city. A banker was discovered in his vault, surrounded by now worthless money, having apparently tried to protect his wealth until the very end. The telegraph operator was found at his station, his hand still on the key, having tried to send one last message. In the hospital, the Sisters of St. Paul were found at their posts, having stayed with their patients rather than flee. In the ruins of homes, rescuers found the remnants of final moments, meals half-eaten, letters half-written, clothes laid out for a day that never came. In the Prentice house, they found the family together in one room, the parents' bodies shielding their children in a gesture that had been brave but futile. In Andreas Hurar's shop, they found his iron safe intact, and inside, perfectly preserved, his diary and the boots he had been making for the mayor, artifacts of a life interrupted. The rescue efforts continued for weeks, though they were really recovery efforts. There was no one left to rescue except the miracle survivors already found. The bodies couldn't be individually identified in most cases. The heat had been so intense that it had destroyed not just life but identity. Families were buried together when they could be identified by their location, but many were simply interred in mass graves, their names recorded on memorials, but their bodies anonymous in death. The governor's body was eventually identified by his pocket watch, the gold melted but the inscription still readable. His wife was found near him, her jewelry fused to her bones. The scientific commission that had declared the city safe died with everyone else, their expertise no protection against forces they had failed to understand or respect. As the weeks passed and the full story emerged, the political pressure to stay, the troops preventing evacuation, the censored newspapers, outrage mixed with grief. How many of these deaths could have been prevented? If the governor had ordered evacuation after the first mudflow, if the scientists had admitted their uncertainty, If profit and politics hadn't overruled prudence, how many of those carbonized statues might have been living people? Refugees, perhaps, but alive. But for Ludger-Silbaris, such questions were academic. He had survived through pure chance, a drunken brawl that landed him in the one place in Saint-Pierre that could protect him. When he recovered from his injuries, he would join Barnum and Bailey's circus, touring the world as the only living object that survived the silent city of death. He would show his scars to audiences who paid to see the man who had looked into hell and lived. For Léon Compere-Leandre, survival brought its own burden. He had walked through the destroyed city, had seen his entire world erased, had watched other survivors die in his arms. He would live for another 20 years, but those who knew him said he never fully left Saint-Pierre. That part of him remained forever in those ruins, walking among the carbonized dead. The impossible survivors were living reminders that even in the face of absolute destruction, life could persist through accident, through architecture, through sheer chance. But they were also reminders of all those who hadn't been lucky, who had been in the wrong place when the mountain spoke its final word, who had trusted leaders who valued votes more than lives. Part 7. The City of the Dead. In the days following May 8th, Saint-Pierre transformed from a place of death into something else, a pilgrimage site for the horrified, a laboratory for scientists trying to understand what had happened, and a vast outdoor morgue that challenged every convention of how the dead should be treated. The city that had bustled with 40,000 souls now hosted a different kind of population: rescue workers, journalists, government officials, and those searching desperately for family members they would never find. The smell reached ships while they were still 10 miles out to sea. Sailors described it as unlike anything they had encountered. Not just death, which many of them knew from their travels, but something else. Burned flesh mixed with sulfur, rotting vegetation mixed with the acrid tang of vaporized metal. It was a smell that seemed to coat the inside of the nostrils, that lingered on clothing for weeks, that made hardened men vomit over the rails before they even reached the harbor. Captain Mary of the Gironde, arriving on May 12th with medical supplies that were no longer needed, wrote in his log, "The approach to Saint-Pierre is announced not by sight, but by smell. It carries on the wind like a physical presence. My crew begged to turn back. I cannot blame them. This is not the smell of a battlefield or a plague city. This is the smell of hell itself." The French government had dispatched troops from Fort-de-France to maintain order and begin the grim work of dealing with the bodies. Colonel Gerbeau, commanding the operation, faced a challenge no military manual had prepared him for. How do you bury 40,000 people when you cannot even identify them? When the heat is still so intense that workers can only operate for minutes at a time? When the very act of moving bodies causes them to crumble into ash? And the soldiers worked in shifts of 15 minutes, their faces wrapped in wet cloths soaked in vinegar to combat the smell. Even so, many collapsed from the heat and fumes. They quickly learned that the carbonized bodies couldn't be handled like normal corpses. The slightest touch could cause them to disintegrate. A soldier would reach for what looked like a solid form only to have it collapse into powder and fragments, leaving him holding perhaps a piece of jewelry or a button, the only things that survived intact. The decision was made to bury most victims where they lay. Mass graves were dug throughout the city, and bodies were gathered from the immediate area and interred together. Families found huddled together were buried together when possible. The cathedral congregation was interred in a mass grave in what had been the church garden. But individual identification and burial were impossible for all but a few. The looting began almost immediately, though it was a strange kind of looting. The heat had destroyed paper money, melted gold into unrecognizable lumps, fused silver into bizarre sculptures. But some valuable items had survived in safes and vaults, and desperate survivors from the countryside, people who had lost everything, came seeking anything they could sell or trade for food. The French authorities tried to stop it at first, posting guards at bank buildings and wealthy homes. But the guards themselves were sometimes caught pocketing items, and the scale of the devastation made comprehensive security impossible. Moreover, there was a moral question. Who did these items belong to now? If entire families had been wiped out, if there were no heirs, no records, no way to establish ownership, what should be done with whatever wealth remained? One of the strangest discoveries was made at the Bank of Martinique. The main vault, built to withstand hurricanes and earthquakes, had protected its contents from the worst of the heat. Inside, investigators found stacks of gold francs, their edges melted together into a solid mass worth a fortune, but impossible to separate. Documents had turned to ash at the slightest touch. The bank's ledgers, which might have helped identify account holders and their heirs, were gone. The wealth of Saint-Pierre's elite had survived in a form that mocked its former purpose. The personal effects found throughout the city told intimate stories of final moments. A woman's jewelry box contained a gold locket, the heat having melted it shut. The photographs inside turned to carbon, but still visible as shadows. A child's toy soldier, made of lead, had melted into a puddle, but retained enough shape to be recognizable. Coins in people's pockets had fused together, creating strange medallions of disaster. Perhaps the most poignant discovery was made by the journalist Georges Hébert, who had arrived with the first rescue teams. In what had been a school, he found a classroom where the students had clearly been in the middle of a lesson. Their slate boards were still on their desks, some still showing arithmetic problems or spelling exercises. The children themselves were carbonized in their seats, smaller statues among the many, but the normal scenes on their slates, addition problems, verb conjugations, a child's drawing of a house, spoke of a morning that had started like any other. The cathedral bell, that bronze voice that had marked the hours of Saint-Pierre's life for generations, was found 500 meters from the church, embedded in the ruins of a house. It weighed over a ton, yet the force of the pyroclastic surge had thrown it like a pebble. When workers finally extracted it, they found it was cracked but intact. Someone rang it once, a single, mournful note that echoed across the ruins, before officials ordered it silenced out of respect for the dead. The search for Governor Moutet's body had political as well as humanitarian importance. The government needed to confirm his death officially, and there were questions about his decision-making that required investigation. His body was eventually identified in what had been his office, found with several of his staff members who had died at their posts. The gold rim of his spectacles had melted and fused to his skull, a detail that newspapers would repeat endlessly as a symbol of how even the powerful had been helpless before the mountain's wrath. The recovery teams developed a grim routine. They would mark bodies with numbered stakes, photograph the scene when possible, collect any identifiable items, then arrange for burial. The photographers documenting the disaster had to work quickly. The heat was damaging their equipment, and the film often spoiled in the toxic air. The images they captured would become iconic: streets filled with statue-like corpses, buildings reduced to rubble, ships in the harbor burned to their waterlines. Animals played an unexpected role in the recovery efforts. Search dogs brought from Fort-de-France refused to enter certain areas of the city. They would approach, then back away, whimpering, their tails between their legs. Their handlers couldn't understand it at first. The dogs were trained to find bodies, had worked in disaster zones before. But something about Saint-Pierre terrified them. Perhaps it was the smell or the heat still radiating from the ground, or some instinct that told them this place was fundamentally wrong. Local dogs that had somehow survived on the outskirts of the disaster zone were seen prowling the ruins at night, but they too avoided certain areas. Rescue workers reported seeing them circle around particular spots, taking long detours rather than crossing certain streets. It became a bitter joke among the soldiers. Even the dogs knew which parts of hell to avoid. The international response was overwhelming. Ships arrived from neighboring islands bringing supplies, medical personnel who were no longer needed, and engineers to assess the damage. The British governor of Barbados sent a telegram offering assistance, writing, "The tragedy of Saint-Pierre transcends national boundaries. We are all diminished by this loss. Americans sent money and supplies. The French government declared a period of national mourning. But amid the grief and shock, scientific minds were already at work, trying to understand what had happened." This was unlike any volcanic eruption in recorded history. Vesuvius had buried Pompeii slowly, with ash and pumice. Krakatoa had exploded with massive force, but hadn't produced this racing cloud of superheated gas. Professor Alfred Lacroix, arriving from Paris, coined the term nuée ardente, glowing cloud, to describe what had killed Saint-Pierre. The pattern of destruction fascinated and horrified investigators. They found shadows burned into walls where people had stood, their bodies shielding the stone for a split second before being vaporized. They discovered that glass had melted and flowed like water, then solidified into fantastic shapes. Metal objects had been twisted into impossible configurations. An iron fence wrapped around itself like rope. A steel beam bent into a perfect circle. In some houses they found bizarre preservations. A dining room where the table was set for breakfast, the plates intact but the food carbonized. A bedroom where clothing hung in a wardrobe, protected by the wood that had charred but not burned through, while everything else in the room was ash. These anomalies made the totality of death even more unsettling. If random objects could survive, why couldn't people? The clearing of the city took months. Debris had to be sorted carefully, building materials that could be salvaged, personal effects that might help identify victims, human remains that required burial. The ash itself was a problem. It had mixed with rain in the days after the eruption, creating a concrete-like substance that had to be chipped away. Workers described it as like excavating a city that had been encased in gray cement. As the work progressed, certain areas were designated as memorials. The cathedral ruins were left partially standing as a monument. The theater, or what remained of it, became a gathering place for mourners. Small shrines appeared throughout the city. A flower placed where someone's house had stood. A cross erected where a family had died together. Candles that were lit each evening and extinguished each dawn. The question of what to do with Saint-Pierre divided the authorities. Some wanted to rebuild, to show that human civilization could triumph over natural disaster. Others argued it should be left as ruins, a monument to the dead and a warning to the living. Still others, particularly the church, suggested the entire site should be consecrated as a vast cemetery, holy ground where so many had died. While these debates continued, nature began its own reclamation. Within weeks, small plants were pushing through the ash, their green shoots almost obscene against the gray devastation. Insects returned first, then birds, then small animals. The jungle that had been held back by human habitation began its slow advance into the ruins. Life, in its persistent way, was returning to the city of the dead. By July, 3 months after the eruption, most of the bodies had been buried or burned, most of the valuable items recovered or looted, most of the documentation completed. The French government declared the emergency phase over and reduced the military presence. Saint-Pierre was left with a small caretaker force, their job to maintain order in a city that no longer needed it. Visitors came, drawn by curiosity or grief. They walked the empty streets, now cleared of bodies but still bearing the scars of that morning, melted lampposts, shattered walls, the strange shadows burned into stone. They spoke in whispers as if afraid to disturb the dead. They took small pieces of melted glass or fused metal as souvenirs, memento mori of a city that had died in 3 minutes. The official death toll was set at 29,933, but everyone knew this was an approximation. The refugee population had swelled the city's numbers, and no accurate count had been taken. Some bodies had been completely vaporized, leaving no trace. Others had been washed out to sea. The true number would never be known, but it hardly mattered. What mattered was that an entire city, an entire community, an entire way of life had been erased. As the months passed and the immediate horror faded, Saint-Pierre began its transformation from a place of death to a place of memory. The ruins became a classroom where scientists studied volcanic behavior. The stories of the victims became cautionary tales about the danger of ignoring nature's warnings. The city of the dead became, paradoxically, a teacher for the living. Part 8. Aftermath and Ghosts. Mount Pelée was not finished. As if the destruction of Saint-Pierre hadn't been statement enough, the volcano continued its violent awakening through May of 1902. Scientists monitoring the mountain noted continuous activity. Steam plumes, ash emissions, the occasional pyroclastic surge that would race down the empty slopes toward a city that was no longer there to destroy. The mountain seemed to be raging at an enemy it had already vanquished. On May 20th, just 12 days after Saint-Pierre died, Pelée delivered another devastating blow. At 5:45 in the morning, an eruption even more powerful than the one on May 8th sent a massive pyroclastic surge down the mountain slopes. This time it took a slightly different path, racing toward the town of Morne Rouge and the areas where rescue operations had established their camps. The rescue workers had thought they were safe. They were miles from Saint-Pierre, separated by ridges and valleys that should have provided protection. They had set up field hospitals for burn victims who never came, supply depots for a population that no longer existed, communication posts to coordinate efforts that were winding down. Nearly 2,000 people were in the path of this second surge. Soldiers, doctors, journalists, government officials, and refugees who had fled the earlier destruction. They had perhaps 30 seconds of warning, just long enough to see the glowing cloud cresting the ridge, just long enough to understand that the mountain's hunger hadn't been satisfied. The surge swept through the camps with the same devastating efficiency it had shown in Saint-Pierre. Tents vaporized. Supply wagons exploded. Men who had spent 12 days recovering bodies became bodies themselves. Among the dead was Father Mary, who had been leading efforts to create a memorial for the victims of Saint-Pierre. He had been holding a dawn mass for the rescue workers, blessing them for another day of grim labor. They found his body still at the makeshift altar, his hands clasped in prayer. The communion wine had boiled in its chalice. The bread had turned to carbon. Around him lay his congregation, frozen in their final genuflection. The second disaster finally convinced authorities that the entire northern region of Martinique had to be evacuated. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned. Plantations that had produced sugar for generations were left to the jungle. Roads were barricaded, and soldiers were posted. Not to keep people in this time, but to keep them out. An exclusion zone was established around Pelée, extending for miles in every direction. The economic impact was catastrophic and immediate. Saint-Pierre hadn't just been a city. It had been the economic heart of Martinique. The banks were gone, and with them, the records of loans, investments, and savings. The warehouses full of rum and sugar waiting for export were destroyed, along with the contracts and agreements they represented. The ships in the harbor, representing multiple nations' merchant marines, were total losses. Sugar plantations across the island found themselves without a market, without a port to ship from, without banks to finance the next planting. Many were already abandoned, their workers having fled or died. The elaborate system of credit and commerce that had sustained Martinique's economy for centuries collapsed overnight. Fortunes that had taken generations to build were erased in 3 minutes. The French government faced demands for compensation from multiple sources. Foreign nationals had died in Saint-Pierre, Americans, British, Germans, Italians. Their governments wanted answers and restitution. Insurance companies fought to avoid paying claims, arguing that volcanic eruptions were acts of God beyond their policy's coverage. Lawsuits would drag on for years, creating a legal aftershock that rumbled through courts in Paris, London, and New York. But the most damaging aftermath was political. As investigators pieced together the timeline of the disaster, the full scope of Governor Mouttet's failure became clear. The censored newspapers, the blocked evacuation routes, the suppressed scientific warnings, all in service of an election that would never happen. Documents recovered from the governor's office showed he had received multiple warnings about the danger, but had dismissed them all as alarmist. The French colonial ministry launched an investigation that became a scandal. Witnesses testified that the governor had threatened to arrest anyone who tried to organize an evacuation. Scientists who had been pressured to downplay the danger came forward with their stories. The editor of Les Colonies, Marius Hurrat, who had died with everyone else, was posthumously vindicated when his private letters revealed his anguish at being forced to print reassuring lies. The investigation's conclusion was damning, but ultimately toothless. The guilty were all dead. Governor Mouttet, his staff, the scientific commission that had declared the city safe, the military commanders who had blocked the roads, all had paid the ultimate price for their decisions. There was no one left to prosecute, no one to blame who hadn't already been judged by the mountain itself. For Lugger Silbaris, the aftermath took a peculiar turn. Once he recovered from his burns, he found himself famous, the man who had survived the unsurvivable. Newspapers around the world wanted his story. Scientists wanted to study him. Showmen wanted to exhibit him. It was this last group that won. Barnum and Bailey's circus, always alert to opportunity, offered Silbaris a contract. He would travel with the greatest show on earth, appearing in a replica of his cell, telling his story to audiences who paid to see the only living object that survived in the silent city of death. It was exploitative, certainly, but it was also a living, more money than a laborer from Martinique could have imagined. For years, Silbaris traveled across America and Europe, telling his story twice a day to crowds who gasped at his scarred back, who shuddered at his description of the heat, who marveled that anyone could survive such horror. He would demonstrate how he had pressed himself against the cool stone walls, how he had urinated on his clothes to create moisture, how he had prayed and sung and called for help that didn't come for 4 days. The other confirmed survivor, Léon Compere-Leandre, shows a different path. He wanted nothing to do with fame or fortune. He moved to Fort-de-France, opened a small shop, and tried to rebuild some semblance of normal life. But those who knew him said he was haunted. He would wake screaming from nightmares. He couldn't bear to be near fires. The smell of anything burning would send him into panic. Compere-Leandre rarely spoke of what he had seen, but once, years later, he told a priest, "People think I was lucky to survive, but I didn't survive. The person I was died with everyone else. What walks around now is something else, someone who has seen hell and can never forget it." The scientific community, meanwhile, was revolutionizing the understanding of volcanoes based on what had happened at Saint-Pierre. The pyroclastic surge that had killed the city was a phenomenon that hadn't been properly documented before. Professor Alfred Lacroix spent years studying Pelée, establishing the principles of pyroclastic flow behavior that would save countless lives in future eruptions. The term Peléan eruption entered scientific vocabulary, describing this particular type of volcanic violence: the lateral blast, the superheated gas cloud, the incredible speed that made escape impossible. Volcanology as a modern science was essentially born from the ashes of Saint-Pierre, built on the data gathered from 30,000 deaths. Mount Pelée itself remained active for years. Major eruptions continued through 1903, and a new lava dome grew in the crater, rising like a giant tooth from the mountain's mouth. Scientists called it the Tower of Pelée, a spine of solid lava pushed up from below, growing sometimes by meters per day, then collapsing and regrowing. It was as if the mountain was building a monument to its own power. Slowly, tentatively, people began to return to the area around Saint-Pierre. Not to the city itself, that remained off-limits, but to the surrounding countryside. The volcanic ash had indeed made the soil incredibly fertile, just as the optimists had predicted before the disaster. Crops grew with unusual vigor. The jungle reclaimed abandoned plantations with startling speed. Nature was demonstrating its own form of recovery. By the 1920s, a new town had grown near the ruins of Saint-Pierre. Also called Saint-Pierre, it was built just outside the danger zone, a modest settlement that bore no resemblance to the grand city that had preceded it. The new residents lived with one eye always on the mountain, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. They had learned what their predecessors had not, that Pelé's silence meant nothing, that civilization's permanence was an illusion. Visitors to the ruins found a city frozen in time, but slowly being consumed by nature. Vines wrapped around melted lampposts. Trees grew through the floors of ruined houses. The jungle was patient, but inexorable, gradually erasing the last physical traces of the Paris of the Caribbean. What remained were fragments, a section of theater wall, the cathedral steps, the dungeon cell where Silbaris had survived. That cell became a pilgrimage site of sorts. Tourists would stand inside it, trying to imagine 4 days of darkness and heat and terror. They would touch the stone walls that had somehow been just thick enough, positioned just right enough, built just strong enough to preserve one life out of 40,000. Some saw divine providence. Others saw only the random cruelty of chance. In 1929, Mount Pelée began showing signs of renewed activity. This time, there was no hesitation. The entire population of northern Martinique evacuated immediately. Villages emptied. The new Saint-Pierre became a ghost town overnight. The government didn't need to issue orders. The people remembered. They had either lived through 1902 or grown up with the stories. When Pelée spoke, you ran. The eruption, when it came, was minor compared to 1902. A few pyroclastic flows, some ash fall, but nothing approaching the violence of that May morning. The evacuees returned to find their homes intact, their fears unrealized. But no one suggested they had overreacted. Better 100 false alarms than another Saint-Pierre. Today, more than a century later, the ruins of old Saint-Pierre are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A museum displays artifacts from the disaster, melted glass formed into impossible shapes, church bells fused into abstract sculptures, photographs of the city before and after. The famous cell where Silbury survived is preserved, though time and weather have worn away the scorch marks on its walls. A memorial lists the names of the known dead, though it acknowledges that thousands died unnamed and uncounted. Fresh flowers appear there regularly, left by descendants of survivors or by visitors moved by the story. The inscription in French and Creole reads, "To those who died here on May 8th, 1902. Your deaths were not in vain if we remember to listen when the earth speaks." Mount Pelée last erupted in 1932 and has been quiet since. Scientists monitor it constantly. Seismographs detect every tremor, gas analyzers sample every emission, satellite imagery tracks every change in temperature. The technology that didn't exist in 1902 now provides weeks or months of warning. The mountain is not dead, scientists insist, only sleeping. It will wake again. The new Saint-Pierre has grown into a small city of about 4,000 people, built with modern volcanic hazard planning. Evacuation routes are clearly marked. Warning sirens are tested monthly. Every school child knows the evacuation plan. The lessons of 1902 are built into the architecture, the infrastructure, the very culture of the place. But human memory is short, and human nature doesn't change. Property values are rising in the danger zones as people forget why they were dangerous. Political considerations still influence safety decisions. Economic pressures still encourage risks. The memorial's warning, to listen when the earth speaks, competes with the louder voices of profit, progress, and the persistent human belief that disaster happens to other people, in other places, at other times. The ghosts of Saint-Pierre, if they exist, might recognize this pattern. They, too, had believed in their city's permanence. They, too, had trusted their leaders. They, too, had rationalized the warnings until it was too late. The mountain had tried to tell them, in every language it knew, sulfur and snakes, ash and earthquakes, mud flows and dying rivers. But they had translated these warnings into the language they preferred: temporary inconvenience, scientific interest, political opportunity. Perhaps that's the most lasting ghost of Saint-Pierre, not the spirits of the dead, but the specter of willful ignorance, the haunting possibility that, given the same circumstances, the same pressures, the same choices, we would make the same mistakes. The ruins stand as a monument not just to those who died, but to the eternal human capacity to ignore what we don't want to see, to rationalize what we don't want to believe, to stay when every instinct says run. The mountain still stands, patient and eternal, wearing its crown of clouds. It has no malice, no memory, no regret. It simply is what it is, a vent in the earth's skin, a reminder that the ground beneath our feet is temporary, that our cities are built on borrowed time. Most days it's easy to forget this. Most days the mountain is just a mountain. But sometimes, when the wind is right, you can still smell sulfur on the slopes of Pelée. Closing, into the quiet dark. And so we come to the end of our time in Saint-Pierre, though in truth there is no real ending to such a story. The mountain still stands, the ruins remain, the questions persist. What we're left with, here in the quiet hours, are reflections that ripple outward from that morning in May, touching shores we cannot see. Time moves differently when we think about disasters. The 3 minutes it took for Saint-Pierre to die were both infinite and instantaneous. For those living through it, each second must have stretched into forever. For us, looking back across more than a century, it seems to have happened in a blink. 30,000 lives ended between one breath and the next. An entire civilization, erased before the coffee had cooled in their cups. Perhaps that's why we return to these stories when the sleep won't come, when our own troubles feel too large to bear. There's something about the scale of historical tragedy that paradoxically makes our personal struggles feel both smaller and more precious. Smaller because whatever keeps us awake tonight, the unpaid bills, the relationship troubles, the work stress, pales before the image of a mountain exploding. More precious because we're here to have these problems. We woke up this morning, we'll wake up tomorrow. That's not nothing. That's everything. The people of Saint-Pierre had problems too, on the morning of May 8th. The baker, Joseph Moreau, was worried about his flour supplies. Clara Prentice was concerned about her children's education. Andreas Hurar was thinking about his daughter's wedding. Small problems, ordinary problems, human problems that gave shape and meaning to their days. All of them rendered irrelevant in 3 minutes, but until those 3 minutes, they were the entire world. There's a strange comfort in knowing that people have always been people. That a shopkeeper in 1902 kept a diary just like we might keep a journal. That parents worried about their children then as they do now. That political considerations overruled common sense then as they sometimes do today. The technology changes, the clothes change, the languages evolve, but the human heart remains remarkably consistent across the centuries. As we settle deeper into this quiet time, let's think about the survivors for a moment. Not their suffering, which we've already examined, but their resilience. Luger Silbaris, who turned his miraculous survival into a living, traveling the world with his story. Was it exploitation? Perhaps, but it was also adaptation, taking the worst thing that had ever happened to him and finding a way to live with it, literally. Every night, he would step into a replica of the cell that saved him, and in doing so, perhaps he reclaimed some power over his trauma. Léon Compere-Leandre, who chose the opposite path, seeking obscurity and normalcy after walking through hell. He opened his shop, served his customers, lived his quiet life. Both men found ways to continue, to wake each morning and engage with the world, even though they had seen it end. There's a profound courage in that ordinariness, in the simple act of continuing to exist after everything suggests you shouldn't. The night is deeper now, and perhaps your breathing has begun to slow. Perhaps the weight of the day is starting to lift from your shoulders. Let's move our thoughts from the catastrophic to the continuous, from the explosive to the eternal. The jungle that reclaimed Saint-Pierre did so with no malice, no memory, no judgment. Vines wrapped around ruins, not to hide them, but simply because that's what vines do. Trees grew through abandoned houses not to erase human presence, but because trees grow toward light wherever they find it. Nature's indifference is sometimes terrifying, as the people of Saint-Pierre learned, but it can also be oddly comforting. The rain doesn't care about our mistakes. The sun rises regardless of our failures. The seasons turn whether we're ready or not. There's a rhythm to the natural world that continues beneath and beyond human drama, a baseline of existence that persists through all our sound and fury. Think about Mount Pelée itself, standing there still in the Caribbean darkness. Right now, as you listen to these words, it's there. Perhaps clouds are gathering around its peak. Perhaps stars are reflecting off the moisture on its slopes. It doesn't remember what it did. It doesn't regret or feel pride or carry guilt. It simply is, a mountain being a mountain, following geological processes that operate on timescales we can barely comprehend. In 1,000 years, the ruins of Saint-Pierre will be completely gone, returned to jungle, or buried under new growth. In 10,000 years, even the memory of the disaster might be lost. But the mountain will still be there, perhaps dormant, perhaps active, perhaps building toward another eruption that will find no city to destroy because humans will have learned finally not to build in its shadow. Or perhaps we'll have forgotten the lesson again and built something new and vulnerable, because that too is human nature. The sounds of modern life are probably fading around you now. The traffic outside your window, if there was any, has likely diminished. The neighbor's television has been turned off. The house is settling into its nighttime configuration. Walls cooling, pipes quieting, the whole structure relaxing into darkness. These sounds, or their absence, are the soundtrack of safety, of a world where mountains don't explode, where the ground stays still, where morning will come as expected. But even in our safety, we carry traces of Saint-Pierre with us. Every time we ignore a warning because it's inconvenient. Every time we trust authority over instinct. Every time we stay when we should go, or go when we should stay. The patterns that killed Saint-Pierre are written into our nature. The optimism bias that says disaster won't happen to us. The normalcy bias that interprets danger as routine. The social pressure that makes us follow the crowd even when the crowd is wrong. Yet we also carry the lessons. Every evacuation route marked in a modern building. Every tsunami warning system in a coastal city. Every volcano monitored by satellites and seismographs. Each of these represents knowledge purchased with lives, wisdom written in ash and sorrow. The ghosts of Saint-Pierre, if we can call them that, live on in every safety regulation, every emergency drill, every moment when someone says, "This doesn't feel right," and is actually heard. The darkness is complete now, or as complete as it ever gets in our electric age. But this is a different darkness than what Ludger Sibarus experienced in his cell. This is chosen darkness, peaceful darkness, darkness that we can banish with the flip of a switch if we choose. We're not trapped. We're not in danger. We're simply resting, letting our minds wander through history, while our bodies prepare for sleep. Sometimes in the small hours of the night, the boundaries between past and present seem to thin. The people of Saint-Pierre feel less like historical figures and more like distant relatives, connected to us through the commonality of human experience. They love their children the way we love ours. They worried about money and status and the future. They made coffee in the morning and said prayers at night. They assumed tomorrow would come because it always had. And for most of us, most of the time, tomorrow does come. We wake, we rise, we engage with our small corner of the world. The disasters that find us are usually personal, loss, illness, disappointment, rather than geological. But we survive them, or we don't, with the same courage or cowardice, wisdom or foolishness that humans have always shown. We're not so different from the people of Saint-Pierre. We just haven't met our mountain yet. But enough of such thoughts. The time for analysis has passed. Now is the time for rest, for letting go of the day's concerns and tomorrow's worries. The story of Saint-Pierre has been told. The lessons, such as they are, have been drawn. What remains is silence, darkness, and the slow rhythm of your breathing. Somewhere in the Caribbean, Mount Pelée sleeps under stars we cannot see. The ruins of old Saint-Pierre rest under vegetation that grows a little thicker each year. The new Saint-Pierre sleeps with one eye open, its people carrying the inherited memory of catastrophe. The ocean waves lap against beaches of black volcanic sand, the same rhythm they've kept for millions of years, indifferent to human time. And here, wherever you are, you're safe in your bed or your chair, or wherever you've chosen to rest. The ground beneath you is solid. The air you breathe is cool and clean. Whatever troubles brought you here tonight seem, perhaps, a little smaller now, placed in the context of geological time and historical tragedy. Your problems are real, but so is your survival. You're here. You made it through today. Tomorrow, almost certainly, you'll wake and continue. The story fades now into the background hum of existence. Just another tale of human triumph and failure, of nature's power and our perpetual surprise at it. Just another reminder that we live on a ball of molten rock, covered with a thin skin of cool stone and water, hurtling through space at unimaginable speed. And yet somehow we manage to forget this most of the time. We make our plans. We live our lives. We assume permanence where none exists. And that's okay. That's human. That's how we survive. Not by constantly contemplating catastrophe, but by building anyway, by loving anyway, by planning for futures that may not come. The people of Saint-Pierre weren't fools for living their lives. They were human, beautifully and tragically human, right up until the moment they weren't. Sleep now. If sleep is what you seek, let the last images of Saint-Pierre fade into the comfortable darkness behind your eyelids. Let the mountain recede into memory. Let the voices of the past whisper themselves into silence. You've carried their story for a while. You can set it down now. In the morning, and there will almost certainly be a morning, you'll wake to your own life, your own challenges, your own small corner of the world that needs tending. The coffee will taste like coffee, not sulfur. The ground will be steady beneath your feet. The mountain, whatever form your mountain takes, will probably stay quiet for another day. And if it doesn't, if tomorrow brings its own catastrophe, its own 3 minutes of hell, well, you'll face it the way humans always have, with whatever courage or wisdom you can muster in the moment. But that's tomorrow's concern. Tonight, there is only rest. The story is over. The darkness is complete. The mountain sleeps, and so should you. Breathe in, breathe out, let go. Into the quiet dark we go, carried by the ancient rhythm of rest that connects us to every human who ever lived, including those who died on a May morning in 1902 when the mountain would no longer sleep. Rest now, rest, and let the silence take you.